Welcome. Last week I showed you how you can do these fluted bowls, and now they have been bisque-fired and I'm ready to glaze them, and I promised to show you that. So if you follow to the end of this video, you will see the final results. When I showed you how to make these fluted bowls, I hope that you realized they're not that difficult to make. And the same thing applies to glazing. It's actually pretty easy, especially if you did, like I did, trim a foot so you can hold on to it. Because remember, we're not glazing the lower part. That will just turn black. And now you're thinking, this is not very black. And true, it isn't. It's a funny thing with this clay. When you bisque-fire it, it becomes gray. And then when you raise it up to glaze temperature, in my case, it's roughly about 1220 degrees Celsius, it turns almost entirely black. So there's another step to this. So we're only going to glaze it inside and out. Now the only thing I would suggest that you think about when you're glazing this is have a glaze that what we call breaks over edges. So in other words, when it comes over edges, it will float out a little bit, so it will be thinner on the top of the edges and thicker at the grooves. And some glazes change color a lot when that happens. And that will highlight these textures, and I think that's beautiful. One of the glazes that I use a lot is called Floating Blue. There's a lot of variations of Floating Blue out there. I'm using one that have replaced Red Iron Oxide with manganese dioxide. That gives a little more of a purple break instead of a brownish break. Old Forge creation, I will put a link somewhere, have a recipe that looks almost like the one I'm using on glazed.org. So in case you want to use the same blue that I'm using here, there's a recipe. But not only that, I'm also going to decorate inside with some white and maybe some splashes of oxides. I'll see as we go. First, we need to clean them because, like always, there could be some dust. There most likely is some dust. And unless you wipe that off, the glaze won't stick. Maybe also you left some finger mark or something. So always clean them. For that, keep a fresh bucket of water and a couple of sponges and just lightly rinse it. You don't want it to be too wet, because if it's too wet, then you also need to dry it before you can glaze. And we don't have to be concerned with the lower part because we're not going to glaze that. So just the inside and the upper part. And as always with textured pots, it's really difficult. It can be difficult to clean all those textures. But if you use a small sponge, you can sort of get into those grooves. So that's it. Then I'll do the other ones. If I had to glaze it all the way down to the foot, I may have wanted to add some wax, because that makes it easier to clean the foot afterwards. But since we're not going to have any glazes there, it's really, really easy. I'll show you in a second. So it's super fast. That's it. Now I cleaned them all and I'm going to mix up my glaze and get ready for glazing. Now we're ready to glaze. And I mixed up a fresh bucket of my Floating Blue and I sieved it and I adjusted it. So now it's perfect and ready for application. This glaze needs to be applied very thick. It is tricky. Some people hate Floating Blue because it turns brown. And that could be because the thickness is not right. It needs to be very thick. So the specific gravity also needs to be low. It needs to be very thick. At least my experience. So I'm going to start out with glazing inside. I'm just going to pour some glaze in it. And I have plenty of time here. I'm just going to swirl it around because the longer it stays, the thicker it gets. And for this particular glaze, I never made it too thick. I sometimes, a long time ago when I started using it, made it too thin, but never too thick. So give it time. It can be like 10, 20, 30 seconds or something. And then when you think it's enough, just pour it out. And I think this looks good. Of course, as always with glazing, it's a matter of experience. Now it's time to do the outside. And remember, I only want the glaze to go around here to the edge. So this one is unglazed and this is glazed. So to do that, I just need to dip it and do it so that it's aligned, so we get the same border all the way around. It's usually pretty easy because you can see it here. And you can lift it up and down a few times, and you can even just let it soak in a little more at the top so it becomes thicker at the top than at the bottom. And now you may heard that it did a little bit of a splash, and we got a little bit of glaze up there, and I don't want that. So just after you've finished, there's also a little bit of a splash here. I don't want that. That's easy to remove. So now this is glaze, but we're going to do something more with it. So I'm just going to put it aside, and then we're going to do the next ones. You don't have to be obsessed with getting it all the way up to the edge, because you're also going to dip it, so that's going to be glazed again. And yeah, it's going to have a double glaze there, but as I said, with floating blue, can almost never get too much. If it's a different kind of glaze that requires a thinner layer, then of course you need to do this swirling much faster. That's the case with the yellow and the green glaze that I use for my plates. It needs to go in and out really quickly, and that's another challenge. This is so easy. So now with this bowl, it's a little more tricky because I didn't actually make a very good foot. I decided to have this design, so it's a little more difficult to grab onto. So when you push it down, it want to float up. So I really just need to balance it and see how well that goes. This is easy enough. I'm just going to push it down. And I think that's good. And now a little more on the other side. And then I'm going to use all my finger strings. Yeah! It's not that easy, but I think we made it. There's a little bit of splashing there. And I want to remove that. And I think I accidentally dipped it a little too much here, so I want to at least thin that out a little bit. So I think this looks good. So when you do your pots, when you make them, it can be a good idea to think about how they're going to end. Not only in terms of what glaze you're going to use, and then carve and prepare your pot so it works with that glaze. And of course choose a clay that works well with that glaze too. But also the things like the foot. I mean, I knew that even with this less square or distinct foot, I would still be able to push it down. But I mean, it would have been easier with a more distinct foot. So it's something you should keep in mind. So always think through and prepare your pots for whatever they're going to be used with, what glazes and application. So I think that looks good too. So I'm just going to dip this. that was a lot of splashing, so there's a little bit of cleaning there. Yeah. See, that was my mistake. But again, now that it's wet, and with a sponge, it's really easy to get it out. And so, but I still want to do that. See, also when I make it wet, it almost becomes black. That's so the color gets after the glaze fire. So, I think that's it. See, the problem here with the splashing is because if I don't get it down completely even, some air will trap in under it and that will create the bubble and the splashing. But again, it's very little and it's easy enough to clean. So, but it's better, of course, if you can avoid it. So, got a couple of splashes, but we'll clean that up. I think there's one on the other side too. Yeah, just a little one. So, looks good. I really love glazing. It's such a relaxing task. I used to hate glazing because I felt like glazing was that stage where you take perfectly good pots and destroy them with useless glazes. I glazed and I glazed and I glazed, and I made really good pots, but every time I glazed, it looks like, well, shit. But so all my nice pots were sort of destroyed. But then slowly, I learned how to glaze. I learned to mix some glazes that I like, and I learned how to work with those glazes. And now I actually love it because a really good glaze work does complete your pot in a beautiful way, or it can complete your pot in a beautiful way. But it is a very different task than creating the pottery. All that work with the clay and wheel throwing and sintering and shaping and carving. When it comes to glazing, it's more about chemistry, really. It's the mix between the chemicals in your glaze, but also the clay, the chemicals in the clay, and of course, the way that you fire it. So it's much more about chemistry. So I had to read up on my chemistry, which I actually think is interesting. So if you hate that part, maybe you want to go with just commercial glazes. There are lots of really nice glazes on the market. But for example, this Floating Blue, I haven't seen any pottery store that have anything like that. So if you want something special, or if you want to adjust your glazes to your requirements or liking, then you need to mix it yourself. So I think this looks good too. And here's another one with a tricky foot, but it does have a lot more to grab onto. So this is not as tricky as the other one. You may think that this is a really long time and that I'm applying too much glaze, but I promise you, I didn't. It needs to be very thick. And now, but let me see if I can avoid getting any. Yeah. Oh, it sort of becomes a game not to splash it or bubble it, but I haven't succeeded so much. But again, if it's something you can wipe off with a sponge, as I can in this case, and I wouldn't even call it a failure. It's just a minor inconvenience, but it works. I mean, it's just this small part. This takes a few seconds. And the other good thing about this type of glazing is, of course, you don't need to protect your shelves, except if you have a lot of glaze here, it may create little pearls that drips down. But these will be round pearls, not on the foot, but on your shelf, and they're usually very easy to flip off. And so it's not hurting your pot, and it's not hurting your shelves. So all's good. And this is the last one. This is the small one. Remember, I made one that's not so big. This is like perfect for a small salad for two, or some hummus, or dipping of some kind. Let's see if we can make this last one without any bubbles. So far, so good. Small one, but it didn't splash up on the sides, so all good. That was the last one, but we're not finished yet. Because even though the floating blue glaze looks awesome on its own, I like to enhance it, and I like to play around with multiple glazes and oxides. You've probably seen some of my past videos, and that creates an even more unique look, because everybody can mix up floating blue, and of course anybody could try and mimic what I do, but it won't be exactly the same. So it will be more of a unique impression that I get out of it. So I'm going to use some white glaze, and for that I'm going to use this Heath A2 White. I can also put a link to the glazed.org recipe for that. It's not a big secret or anything. It's a wonderful white glaze, and it works well with the floating blue. It floats into it. And that's always an issue, because you can have glazes that both look good, but for some reason, I don't always know why, there's a chemical reaction between the two glazes. It just doesn't work. So they sort of escape each other and create little areas with no glazing. It can look really bad, or it can look amazing, depending on what you want. But at least it's something you want to test. But this white works really well. So for this, I'm going to add a little bit on the inside. I won't do it on the outside, because I don't want that to run too much to get all those little drips hanging down from the side. So I'm only going to decorate additionally on the inside. I love these little fan brushes, and I bought a whole bunch of them, very cheap, in the supermarket ones. And these are nylon. It's not a very high quality brush, but it works really well for adding the type of star decoration, lack of a better word. But what I do is I brush it from the inside out like this. So that, in my experience, creates some really interesting variations on the inside. As you know, I always like to experiment. And today I'm going to try a toy. a little children's spinner. And so how I'm going to use that, I'll show you. And I have no idea if it's going to work. But it includes a spinner. You know, these little ones, you can turn it and it spins. And a trail slip tube like this. So I sucked up some of the white glaze into this. Just remember to shake it before you use it. And I want to keep the lid, or the tip of it, clean. And then I will spin it inside the pot. Let me show you. So this, I cannot promise you it's going to work, but I'm going to try and spin it in here. And then I will drip the glaze on it, and hopefully it will splash out in a beautiful way. That's not too bad. Now, I smudged the edge a little bit because I didn't realize that the floating blue wasn't completely dry, so it was a little bit wet. I can fix that later. I think I'm going to spin it a little bit more. I think that's interesting. Look. I think it would work better with a more shallow bowl. I have a big one outside that I'm going to try this with. But it's definitely interesting. I'll maybe try a few more. But before I do that, I'm just going to add an edge of the white up here. So I think that's going to be interesting. Let me try with this one too. At least it's fun. That's yeah, a little more. I think that's good. And I think this one, I'm just going to leave like that and see how that goes. It's a little more tricky with this small one, but on the other hand, it's also a little more shallow. So let's try. Yeah, this is this is a lot of fun, and the way that it splatters in a more even way, it's maybe interesting. This is very much bigger, so this is not going to work as well. I'm only going to get a little bit down here. So again, for this one, I think I'm going to add a little bit with my brush. So that's a good combination, I think. I'm not going to stop here. As I mentioned, I will use a little bit of wash, and in this case, a red iron oxide wash. It's just red iron oxide and lots of water, so it becomes very fluent because it's very strong colorant, and I only want very light brushes. If you've seen some of my previous pots, you will see how that sort of creates like a sort of a metallic layer to it that I really like. So let's do that on just a few of the pots. So this again, I'm just going to use something like that. Also, it's a fun way to play with glazes. I'm not much of a painter, and I can't do all these, very detailed decorations, but I can splash colors. And if you play around with that, you find some ways to do it that actually turns out really interesting and unique pots. So that's my game. So now the only thing left is, let me just take these brushes away, is that I also want to dip the very, very top, very lightly, in a dark black clay you can turn gold to. It's called Temmoku Gold. But on top of this floating blue, we'll just add sort of a very dark edge. And I like that as an ending framing of the floating blue. So let's bring that on. Temmoku Gold is also a glaze with a lot of red iron oxide. And I love red iron oxide, and it's a super cheap chemical, so it's nice to use and widely available in nature. So it's not a bad one like cobalt and uranium and stuff like that. So I love that, but it is a very strong colorant. So if you get something on your clothes, if you get something on furniture or something, it will probably stay forever. So you have to be a little more careful with that. So now it's mixed. I'm not going to use this on all of the pots, just a few of them. So what I'm going to do is, if we take this one, for example, I'm just going to dip it, but only like, not even a centimeter, like a quarter of a centimeter, a couple of millimeters. So it's basically mostly the top part of it. And I don't want to turn it too soon because I don't want this, in this case, to run down. So I'm just going to let it dry enough to not run. So now you see, it looks red now, but it won't be red. It will be black. Maybe there will be little sprinkles of gold, which is a funny thing with this glaze going from black to gold. Temmoku Gold. I can put a link to the recipe. It's also very public. It's from John Britt's very good glazing book called Mid-Range Glazes or Mid Glazes for cone 6 firings. So let's do another one. So it's just as you see, what is it? 3-4 millimeters something, maybe half a centimeter, but very, very little. But a thick layer, because the thicker, the darker. The thinner, the more goldy. And in this case, I mean, if we get some gold, it's fine, but I'm mostly aiming for that dark. So it will become almost black and it will sort of frame this whole pot in a way that usually is beautiful. See, I'm not going to do it on this because holding on to this is just too difficult. So, that was perfect. It ran a little bit, but not too much. I should have held it like this a few more seconds. So, I think it's safe now. But you can see it ran just a little bit here. But it's not bad. Now I need to be a little more patient. And I admit that's not one of my strongest qualities, patient. But you gotta do what you gotta do. Yep, that's fine. That was the last one. And this one I actually gave a much quicker dip. It's not going to be as black, but hopefully I'm going to get a little bit of that gold look from this glaze. Maybe not. It's always difficult with this on top of the floating blue because it's so dark in itself that getting that gold variation is not that easy, but we'll try. So that was it. Now I will load the kiln and I'll get ready to fire, and in 1.5 days we'll unload the kiln together and see the result. Good morning. Now it's time to open the kiln and unload the elements. I'm super excited. I'm always excited with the glazing, and I'm not the most patient person, but this is the time where you have to be patient. If you open the kiln too early, your glazes may crackle, and even worse, you could damage your heating elements, or they will live shorter if you give them this cold shock. So please be patient. I know, I hate it too, but it pays off in the end. But now it's about 50 degrees, so it's safe to open it. Sometimes I do open the lid just a little bit under 200 degrees to just speed up the cooling process, because in the end of the cooling it goes slower and slower. To begin with, from 1200 to 1000 goes really fast, but then it goes slower and slower and slower, and in the end it takes forever. So under 200 I open the lid just a little bit to speed up that process, but I don't take it out before it's under 50 or something. I can't touch it anyway. But now it's ready to open, and I already took a peek view, and that's because I had some layers on top that's not related to this. So I already know what it looks like, but let's go and take a look. Ah, This looks really beautiful. I mean, it's not very evident with the spinner, but it did spread out. It does melt into the glaze, but it looks beautiful. So let's go inside and have a closer look at these cuties. So now I'm inside, and I must say, I'm very excited because it turned out exactly like I wanted. I mean, they're so beautiful. I just look at this, the way that the glaze floats around the fluting, and not to mention the inside. This one is just perfect. They're all perfect in each way. I want to highlight a few things like this. If you look at this, can you see that the funny thing is that it turns white down here? That's because it gets really, really thick. And I don't know, somehow it extracts some white elements of this floating blue. And I just think that's beautiful. And then if you look here, there's a little bit of dripping. And that's fine. I think this looks good. But this is also a good reminder that if you put too much glaze on the outside, it may drip all the way down and hit yourself. And this is just perfect. It just creates these little curtains of glaze that I really think is beautiful for these ones. If we look at the inside, it's sort of funny. Let me just find one where I can see. Yeah, this one actually. If you look at the inside, the spinner that we used to spread around the glaze, it's not as distinct as I was naively hoping for. But of course, the fact is that the glaze melts into each other. So the white glaze melts into the blue. So it's not going to be very distinct. If I wanted some distinct patterns, I would probably have to do it at a different stage. Still using the spinner, but with an engrope or something before maybe the bisque fire stage. So when it's bone dry, do the spinner with some engrope or some wash after the bisque fire, and then use a clear glaze or at least some glaze where those two elements don't melt into each other. But nevertheless, I think this turned out just beautiful. Yes, I am very excited. And now you can see also it is almost black. So the gray color we get out of the bisque fire turns black for this glaze. So that's why I love it so much. And also it's super, super smooth. There's only very little grog and it's very fine. So when you burnish it, like I did, it's just so nice to touch. Even I have some friends that don't like clay without glaze because they don't like the feel of it. But this clay, they actually like because it is so smooth that you don't really notice that it's raw clay. And I think this combination of having the glaze up there and then the dark lower part of the pot is just beautiful. Yeah, I am excited. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this demonstration and it inspires you to go and do more textured pots in general, because I do think that it gives so much life to your glazes and especially these fluted bowls. And please go back and watch my video about how I make these fluted bowls, because it is not as difficult as some may think. So please go ahead and do that. And if you like it, please subscribe, share, write a comment, and come back again next week. At 5 p.m. Central European Time, I'm gonna have a new video. So until then, enjoy.